So this is genetic cross of heredity. And genetic cross, you start with this guy right here. And he is the first main person to study all these different things. And he had a few theories, and to understand them, you need to understand what an allele is. So an allele, all it is it's just a version of a gene. And alleles make up what we call the genotype. So a genotype is just a genetic makeup of a trait. So it's the genetic code, and it instructs what proteins are supposed to be made, and it just gives instructions to the body and what everything's supposed to look like. And this genotype makes up what's called the phenotype. So a phenotype is just the observable characteristics of a trait. So for a given trait on a body, let's just for example, we can use hair color. So my phenotype for hair color is blonde for hair color. It's just what you look like. And just remember, so the phenotype is made up of the genotype, and the genotype is made up of the alleles. So we're going to focus in on alleles more, and how they're written, and what they look like, and what different alleles do. So alleles are represented by a letter, and that's how you write them. So the letter is either going to be capitalized, or it's going to be lowercase. So if it's capitalized, that means it's the dominant allele. And if it's lowercase, that means it's a recessive allele. So when writing the genotypes with these two alleles, there are three possibilities that you can end up with. So you can either get capital C, you can get capital C, lowercase c, or you can get lowercase c, lowercase c. And this is because the genotype is written as a series of two letters. That's the genetic code. It's the two letters that express the genotype, which then express the phenotype. So when you have two capital letters, it's called homozygous dominant. So the root homo just means same, and it's dominant because it carries two dominant alleles. So similar, this is also homozygous, two little c's, because it's the same. That's homozygous recessive because it carries two recessive traits. And that leads us to big C, little c. And this is what we call heterozygous. When you're writing heterozygous, you don't need to write heterozygous dominant and heterozygous recessive because it has both. It has one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So looking deeper into this heterozygous or heterozygote, we can go back to Mendel. And Mendel had laws. This law that applies in our case for the heterozygote with one big C dominant and one little c recessive, it's the law of dominance. And what the law of dominance basically says is some alleles are dominant and others are recessive, and an organism with at least one dominant allele will display that dominant allele in the phenotype despite what the other allele is. So what does this mean for us? So for us, this means in our heterozygote C, that let's just say this big C means brown hair and this little c means blonde hair. So because there is at least one dominant allele, this big C, in our genotype, that means that will be expressed in the phenotype over this recessive allele. Now let's say there was two dominant alleles, it would still show the dominant allele in the phenotype because there's at least one dominant allele in the genotype. But if in a homozygous recessive there's two recessives, and there it will show the recessive genotype in the phenotype. So on the topic of Mendel's laws, he had two other important laws, these two being the law of segregation and the law of independent assortment. So for the law of segregation, rather than writing a definition, I can just explain it, because I feel like that's a better way to understand it. So it basically states that during gamete formation, each parent was only going to pass one allele to the offspring, and all the alleles will get split up during meiosis. So what this looks like is, imagine there's two chromosomes. There's one chromosome there, and there's one chromosome here, and these are homologous chromosomes, so they have the same genes on the same locus. So just say that blue. So all four of these have genes for blue eyes, which I'm not saying it's likely, but it's just an example we're going to use right now. So during meiosis, all these are going to get split up, and you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 chromosomes, and these are all going to be in their own respective cells. And they're all going to have that one allele on each chromosome. So basically, what the law of segregation states is that it's not going to give two alleles. Each parent only gives one allele, and then during fertilization, the two alleles come together and they create their own genotype for the offspring. The law of independent postformant basically states that genes for different traits assort independently of each other during gamete formation. So during meiosis, when the chromosomes line up at the equatorial plane during metaphase, they line up randomly. There's no reason or rhyme to the way they go, and it's just completely random, and it just creates more genetic diversity in the offsprings.